The arena went silent before anything even began, and that was the first sign we had already made a mistake. I remember thinking it was a glitch in the sound dampeners, maybe a system hiccup, because arenas don't go quiet on their own. Not when there are 10,000 spectators packed into steel tiers and betting credits are flying across the network like a storm. Not when a fresh match is about to start and everyone is expecting a quick, entertaining outcome. But the silence held, thick and unnatural, like the air itself was waiting for something none of us could yet see. And I have worked arenas for 12 standard cycles. I have seen champions rise and fall, creatures twice the size of transport trucks brought to their knees by coordinated teams. I have seen underdogs try and fail in seconds. I have seen every variation of confidence and fear play out under the floodlights. So when I say this felt wrong, I mean it with the weight of experience, because nothing about this match should have been memorable. It was scheduled as filler between headline bouts, a simple demonstration, a human girl versus a contained predator unit, a mismatch designed for spectacle. The kind of thing that gets a few laughs, a few cheers, and then gets forgotten before the next round of drinks is even poured. And when they brought her out, escorted by two armored soldiers who looked bored more than anything else, the crowd reacted exactly as expected at first, a ripple of amusement, a low murmur, a few scattered laughs that spread outward like a wave. Because she was small, barely over 5 feet by my estimate, standing there in standard issue holding a tire that hung just slightly loose on her frame, no visible enhancements, no armor, no posturing, just a human girl with her hands at her sides and her eyes moving calmly across the arena, as if she were taking notes instead of preparing for anything remotely dangerous. And I remember one of the commentators joking over the broadcast, something about how this would be over before anyone could finish their drink, and normally I would have agree, because that is how these things go. Size matters, mass matters, the galaxy runs on that simple equation. Larger means stronger, stronger means control, control means survival. It is a rule so basic that even hatchlings understand it. And yet, standing there in the center of that arena, under lights calibrated to highlight every weakness, she did not look weak, not in the way I expected, not trembling, not tense, not even defiant, just present, like she had stepped into the wrong room and decided to stay anyway. And that was when I noticed the crowd again, or rather the lack of noise from them, because the laughter had faded too quickly, replaced by something else I could not immediately name, something quieter, sharper, a kind of collective hesitation that does not belong in a place built for spectacle. And I told myself it was nothing, just the novelty of seeing a human in this context. Just curiosity, because humans are still new enough in most sectors to draw attention. And attention can sometimes look like silence if you squint at it the right way. But then the soldiers released her, stepping back with the casual efficiency of beings who expected no resistance. And she didn't move, not immediately, not dramatically, just stood there and adjusted her stance by an inch or two like someone getting comfortable before a long wait. And I felt it again. That subtle shift, that quiet pressure in the air that made my instincts lean forward even when my logic told me to lean back. And I realized, with a clarity I could not explain, that whatever was about to happen in that arena, it was not going to follow the rules we all thought we understood. We told ourselves it was mercy. That was the official line circulating through the control feeds and whispered between handlers. That placing a human in the arena like this was a controlled demonstration, a safe display of interspecies capability, because the predator unit had been restrained to standard aggression parameters and the environment was calibrated to prevent escalation beyond acceptable thresholds. Everything measured, everything predictable. And I remember nodding along to that. Logic, even as something in the back of my mind refused to settle, because mercy implies control, and control requires understanding. And looking at her standing there without any sign of strain or urgency, I realized we did not actually understand what we had put in that arena. But by then the system had already moved forward, the containment gates cycling with a low mechanical hum that echoed across the chamber, drawing the crowd's attention back to where it should have been, back to the other side of the field where the real spectacle was supposed to enter. And I saw people leaning forward again, confidence returning in small waves, because this part made sense, this part followed the rules. Large creature enters, smaller opponent reacts. Outcome resolves quickly, credits exchange hands, routine continues. That is how it always works. And yet she did not even turn her head fully toward the gate, just a slight shift of her gaze, as if she had already calculated everything she needed to know without needing to watch it unfold. And that detail stayed with me longer than it should have, because most beings track threats with intensity, with visible focus, but she looked at it the way someone glances at a clock, noting the time without concern, and I heard one of the junior technicians near me laugh under his breath, something about how she must not realize what was coming. And that explanation spread quickly, because it was comforting, because ignorance is easier to accept than confidence in a situation like this. But then the gate finished opening, and the presence on the other side stepped into the light, massive compared to her, easily triple her height and several times her mass, the kind of creature designed by evolution to dominate its environment through sheer physical authority, and normally that alone would have been enough to trigger a reaction, a step back, a shift in posture, anything that acknowledged the imbalance. But she remained exactly where she was, weight balanced, shoulders relaxed, breathing steady in a way that did not match the energy of the arena at all. And that was when the silence returned, not all at once, but in pieces, as conversations trailed off mid-sentence and the background noise thinned out until individual sound became too loud too, noticeable, like the scrape of a chair or the hum of a nearby console. And I realized people were starting to notice the same thing I was, not consciously perhaps, but instinctively. Something about the way she occupied that space did not align with the role she had been assigned. She was supposed to be the weaker variable in this equation, the expendable element that made the demonstration possible, and yet she stood there like the equation itself had been written incorrectly, like we had all agreed on a set of rules that no longer applied. And I remember thinking very clearly that if this truly was mercy, then it was not for her, because whatever we had just released into that arena, whatever we believed we understood about this situation, it felt less like we were showing restraint and more like we were about to learn the cost of assuming we were in control. Up close, she looked even smaller than she had from the observation deck, and that should have made this easier to process, easier to categorize, because the closer you are to something, the more details you can use to define it, to reduce it into something predictable. But every detail I noticed about her seemed to work against that instinct instead of reinforcing it. Her posture was relaxed but not careless. Her hands hung loosely at her sides with fingers that occasionally flexed as if testing the air rather than reacting to any visible threat. And her eyes moved in slow, deliberate patterns, not scanning for danger the way most beings do, but observing, measuring, like she was gathering information that did not matter to anyone else. And I remember thinking that she looked less like a participant in an arena and more like someone evaluating it. Like the environment itself was under review rather than the situation she had been placed in, and that thought should not have made sense. It should have been dismissed immediately. But it lingered because nothing else fit cleanly either, and when the overhead display finally pulled up her identification data, projected in a faint blue shimmer above the arena floor for all to see, there was a brief moment where the system hesitated a fraction of a second. That most would not have noticed, but I did, because I was watching for anything that might explain the unease settling in my chest. And the name appeared in plain text, simple, almost disappointingly ordinary. Emily Carter, no extended lineage markers, no military rank displayed in the primary field, no enhanced classification tags that would indicate anything beyond a standard human designation. And that should have settled it. That should have confirmed every assumption we had made, because ordinary names belong to ordinary individuals. That is how databases work. That is how systems categorize reality. But then additional lines began to populate beneath it, slower this time, as if the system itself was choosing its words carefully. Origin, Earth, classification, death world. Those terms always draw attention, even from a crowd that pretends to be unimpressed by such labels. Because everyone has heard the stories, exaggerated or not, about what comes from worlds that try to kill everything that lives on them. But even that was not enough to explain the reaction building around me, because death world classifications are not rare anymore. Not in a galaxy this large, and I heard someone nearby mutter that it still would not make a difference against something that size. And logically they were correct. That is how it should work. Scale overrides origin, mass overrides environment. Those are the rules we rely on. But then the rest of the data field filled in, not with long descriptions or detailed combat history. Just fragments, incomplete records, sections marked restricted or unavailable. And that was unusual, because arena systems are designed to display everything relevant to maximize engagement, to give the audience context, to make the outcome feel earned. And when information is missing, it creates a gap, and gaps make people uncomfortable. And I could feel that discomfort spreading, quiet but persistent, like a low-frequency vibration that you cannot hear, but can still feel in your bones. And I looked back down at her, at Emily Carter, standing in the center of that arena with the same steady presence she had maintained since the moment she stepped onto the floor. And I realized something that unsettled me more than anything else so far. She had not looked at the display once, not even a glance, as if whatever was being revealed above her head had no relevance to her at all, as if she already knew exactly what it would say and did not need confirmation. And that level of certainty, that complete lack of curiosity about how she was being presented to an entire arena of spectators, it did not match the behavior of someone outmatched or unaware. It matched something else entirely, something that does not question its position because it has never needed to. And I found myself wondering, for the first time since the match began, if we had not just misunderstood her, but if we had misunderstood the entire situation from the very beginning. By every measurable standard, the comparison should have ended the moment it began, because the creature now fully visible under the arena lights occupied space in a way that demanded attention, its frame stretching across nearly 15 feet from head to tail with a shoulder height that placed it well above twice her own, its mass alone enough to shift the reinforced flooring with each step it took, slow and deliberate, as if it understood that nothing in this environment could challenge it. And that was the expectation the entire arena had come to rely on, because this was what dominance looked like: size, weight, presence, the kind of physical authority that had shaped entire ecosystems across the galaxy. And I could feel the audience trying to return to that familiar logic, clinging to it as the safest explanation for what they were seeing. Because when something is large enough, it simplifies everything else. It removes ambiguity. It tells you who controls the situation without needing further analysis. And yet, standing less than 10 feet away from that overwhelming presence, Emily Carter did not adjust, did not step back, did not raise her arms or shift into any recognizable defensive posture. She simply stood there with the same calm balance she had maintained from the beginning, and the contrast between them was so extreme that it should have been almost comical, a visual imbalance so obvious that it reassured rather than unsettled. But that was not what happened, because the longer the two of them occupied the same space, the less convincing that imbalance became, and I noticed something that should not have mattered but did. The creature slowed as it approached her, not dramatically, not in a way that would draw immediate attention, just a subtle reduction in pace. A fraction of hesitation that would have gone unnoticed if I had not already been looking for inconsistencies, and I told myself it was environmental calibration, that the arena's containment systems were influencing its behavior to maintain safety parameters. But the readouts in front of me showed no such interference. Everything was within expected ranges, no overrides, no adjustments, nothing that explained why a creature built for forward momentum was choosing restraint. And that was when the comparison stopped being about size and started becoming something else entirely. Something harder to quantify, because physical scale is easy to measure, but presence is not. And whatever she carried with her into that arena, it was beginning to occupy space in a way that had nothing to do with her physical dimensions, and I could see the audience reacting to it, even if they could not articulate why. The way their posture shifted, the way conversations failed to restart, the way even the commentators hesitated before filling the silence with their usual confident predictions, because the narrative they relied on was no longer holding together. And I realized that what we were witnessing was not a mismatch in the way we had assumed. It was a failure of comparison itself because we were trying to evaluate her using a scale that no longer applied, and she was not participating in that evaluation at all, not acknowledging it, not responding to it, just existing within it as if the outcome had already been decided somewhere outside of our understanding. And that was when the thought finally formed in a way I could not ignore, that the largest presence in that arena was not defined by size. And if that was true, then everything we believed about how this would unfold was already wrong. The crowd tried to recover. That was the strange part, because you could almost feel the collective decision ripple through the stands as thousands of minds reached for something familiar to hold on to. And then the laughter came back, not as strong as before, not as confident, but present enough to fill the silence that had grown too heavy. A few voices at first, then more joining in, comments thrown across rows about how the delay was making it more dramatic, how the creature was just playing with its food, how the human probably did not even understand what she was standing in front of. And I heard someone behind me say that this was exactly why people paid to watch these matches, for the moment right before the inevitable outcome, when tension stretched just long enough to make the resolution satisfying. And for a brief second it almost worked. The narrative reassembled itself just enough to sound convincing again. Because laughter is powerful like that. It can overwrite instinct. If enough voices agree to ignore what they feel, but even as the sound grew, it did not reach the floor of the arena the way it should have. It hovered above it, detached, like it was happening somewhere else entirely, and down below, Emily Carter did something so small that it would have been invisible under normal circumstances. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, not in preparation, not in reaction, just a minor adjustment. The kind of movement people make when they have been standing for a while and want to get comfortable. And that was the moment everything slipped again, because comfort does not belong in a place like that. Not when you're facing something designed to dominate every environment it enters. Not when every rule says you should be preparing for impact. And yet she looked like someone waiting in line at a quiet store, patient, unhurried, completely unaffected by the scale of what stood in front of her. And the laughter above faltered. Not all at once, but in uneven breaks, like a signal losing strength, because people noticed, maybe not consciously, maybe not in a way they could explain, but they noticed that the expected response was missing. And without that response, the entire situation lost its structure, and I saw the creature hesitate again, a slight tilt of its head, a pause in its forward movement that lasted less than a second, but carried more weight than any display of force could have. Because hesitation implies uncertainty, and uncertainty does not belong to something at the top of a hierarchy. And I checked the readings again, expecting to find some external influence, some system interference that could justify what I was seeing, but the data remained steady, no anomalies, no restrictions beyond the baseline containment parameters, everything exactly as it should be, which meant the hesitation was not imposed, it was chosen. And that realization spread through me with a clarity that was impossible to ignore, because creatures like that do not choose to slow down without a reason. And whatever that reason was, it was standing directly in front of it without making a single aggressive move, without raising her voice, without even changing her expression. And the crowd felt it too, the laughter thinning in a scattered burst that sounded more like attempts to reassure themselves than genuine amusement. And the commentators, who had been so quick to fill the air before, now spoke in shorter sentences, their voices carrying a slight edge of uncertainty they could not fully hide. And I realized that the arena had not returned to normal at all. It had simply shifted into something else, something quieter, sharper, more focused, because the entertainment we expected was no longer the point. The real spectacle had already begun, and it was not about watching something dominate. It was about watching something that did not need to prove it. It started as a feeling before it became a thought, something subtle that moved through the arena like a change in pressure. And I realized it was not coming from the creature. It was coming from us, from the observers, from the soldiers positioned along the perimeter, from the technicians watching their screens, because one by one, without coordination, without any signal to follow, we all began to notice the same thing at the same time. Nothing was happening. And that absence, that refusal of the expected sequence, was beginning to feel heavier than any action could have been, because the longer she stood there without reacting, the more it forced everything else to adjust around her. And I saw one of the perimeter guards shift his stance, just slightly, his grip tightening on his weapon even though there was no instruction to do so, no protocol that justified the movement. And another followed, and then another, small adjustments almost invisible, but they formed a pattern, and patterns mean something, especially in controlled environments where every role is defined and every response is scripted. And this was not part of the script. This was something else, something emerging in real time that none of us had prepared for. And I checked the command feed, expecting to see new directives, a recalibration, anything that would explain the change. But the channel remained quiet, no updates, no overrides, just the same static. Instructions that had been issued at the start: maintain observation, allow demonstration to proceed, ensure containment integrity. And for the first time in my career, those instructions felt incomplete, not wrong, but insufficient, like they were written for a different situation entirely. And I looked back at Emily Carter, standing in the center of the arena with that same measured stillness. And I realized she had not just disrupted the flow of the match, she had disrupted the confidence of everyone watching it. Because confidence depends on prediction, on the ability to anticipate what comes next. And right now, no one knew what came next. Not the crowd, not the commentators, not the soldiers, not even the creature that had been released into the arena with her. And that was the moment it shifted from unease into awareness. Because unease can be ignored, it can be dismissed as nerves or uncertainty. But awareness demands acknowledgement. And I saw it in the way the creature adjusted its position again. Not advancing, not retreating, just recalibrating, as if it were trying to understand something that did not fit into its existing instincts. And that should not have been possible. Because instinct is not something that pauses for analysis. It reacts, it executes, it follows patterns that have been reinforced over generations. But here it was hesitating, adapting in a way that suggested the pattern had changed. And the only variable in that equation was her. And the realization spread through the arena in a way that did not require words, because it was visible in the smallest details. The way the crowd leaned forward but did not cheer, the way the commentators lowered their voices instead of raising them, the way the soldiers along the perimeter stopped shifting and held completely still, as if movement itself might disrupt whatever balance had formed in that space. And I understood then that we were no longer watching a demonstration. We were witnessing a recalibration, not of the arena, not of the systems, but of perception itself, because everything we believed about control, about dominance, about how power presents itself, was being quietly rewritten in front of us. And the most unsettling part was how little she was doing to make that happen. Because she was not forcing the change, she was not declaring it. She was simply existing in a way that made every other assumption collapse around her. And that is when I finally admitted to myself what I had been avoiding since the moment the silence first appeared. We were not in control of the situation anymore. And whatever happened next was not going to follow the rules we thought we understood. The first sign that something had fundamentally shifted did not come from the crowd or the creature. It came from the soldiers, because trained soldiers do not hesitate without reason. They do not question positioning once a scenario has been declared stable. And yet along the perimeter, I watched as one of them took a half step back from the barrier, not enough to draw attention, not enough to trigger protocol, but enough to break formation symmetry. And that single deviation was followed by another, then another, until the perfect circle of controlled authority that had surrounded the arena floor was no longer perfect, small gaps appearing where certainty used to be, and no one called it out. No one corrected it, because to acknowledge it would mean admitting that something was wrong, and that was not a conclusion anyone was ready to reach, not yet. And I understood why, because everything in front of us still looked the same on the surface. The arena was intact, the systems were stable. The creature remained contained within expected boundaries, and Emily Carter was still standing exactly where she had been placed, unchanged, unthreatened, unhurried. And yet the meaning of those visuals had completely shifted, because meaning is not just what you see, it is what you expect to happen next. And that expectation had dissolved, leaving only observation without interpretation. And that is a dangerous place for any controlled system to be, because systems rely on prediction to maintain order. And without prediction, control becomes an illusion, and I could see that illusion beginning to crack in real time, not through any dramatic failure, but through subtle inconsistencies that no longer align with the narrative we had constructed, like the way the creature adjusted its stance again, not advancing, not retreating, just holding position with a level of restraint that did not match its classification, and the way its focus remained fixed on her without the usual signs of escalation, as if it were waiting for something, not reacting, not initiating, just waiting, and that behavior did not belong in this environment, not in a place designed for immediate outcomes and clear hierarchies. And I heard one of the senior officers near the command station clear his throat, a small, almost involuntary sound, but it carried across the silence in a way that drew attention, because it broke the stillness in a way that felt inappropriate, like speaking too loudly in a quiet room. And when he did not follow it with a command, when no new instruction came through the system, it confirmed what many of us had already begun to suspect. There was no plan for this, no contingency, no predefined response for a situation where nothing behaved as expected. And I looked back at her again, at the center of it all, and I noticed something that should have been obvious from the start but had gone unrecognized until now. She was not just calm. She was comfortable, not in the casual sense of someone relaxed in a safe environment, but in the precise, controlled way of someone who understands exactly where they are and what that means, someone who has already assessed every variable and found no reason to change their position. And that level of certainty does not come from ignorance. It does not come from arrogance. It comes from experience, from familiarity with outcomes that others cannot predict. And that realization settled over me with a weight that was impossible to ignore, because it suggested something far more unsettling than any display of force could have. It suggested that this was not new to her, that whatever we believed we were demonstrating, whatever scenario we thought we had created, she had seen something like it before, and if that was true, then we were not observing a participant in an unfamiliar environment. We were observing someone who recognized the environment better than we did. And that thought, more than anything else, made the arena feel smaller than it had just moments before, not in physical dimensions, but in control, because for the first time since the match began, it felt like the boundaries we relied on were not defining her. They were containing us. It spread through the soldiers before anyone said a word, not as panic, not as fear, but as recognition, the kind that arrives quietly and settles in your posture before it ever reaches your voice. And I saw it in the way their attention shifted, no longer split between the creature and the crowd, but narrowing, focusing entirely on her, because whatever uncertainty had existed before was no longer abstract. It had direction now. It had a center, and that center was standing completely still in the middle of the arena. And one of the officers near the command rail finally spoke, not loudly, not with authority, but with the careful tone of someone testing a thought before committing to it, asking for a closer scan, requesting confirmation on identification. And the system responded immediately, pulling data from multiple sources, cross-referencing, verifying, and projecting additional layers of information above the arena floor. And this time the delay was longer, noticeable even to those who were not watching for it, because the system did not like uncertainty. It was built to resolve it, to eliminate ambiguity as quickly as possible. And when it could not, when it hesitated, that hesitation became part of the atmosphere, adding weight to everything that followed. And the new data did not clarify anything. It complicated it, because instead of detailed records and clear classifications, it returned fragments again, restricted fields, incomplete logs, references to deployments that were not listed in any standard archive, and that alone would have been unusual. But what made it worse was how the system labeled those gaps, not as errors, not as missing entries, but as redacted, intentionally removed, intentionally hidden. And I heard someone behind me whisper that humans did not have access to that level of clearance, not in this sector, not in any sector that mattered. And yet the data in front of us said otherwise without actually saying anything at all. and I realized that we were no longer trying to understand her through what was present. We were trying to understand her through what was absent, through the things we were not allowed to see. And that is a far more unsettling process because absence does not give you limits. It gives you possibilities, and possibilities expand in ways that logic cannot easily contain. And down below, the creature shifted again, but this time it was different. Not just a pause or a minor adjustment, but a clear refusal to close the remaining distance, holding just outside of what should have been engagement range, as if there were an invisible boundary that it recognized, but we did not. And that detail changed everything, because it suggested that whatever information we were missing, whatever classification had been withheld, it was not missing to the creature. It was not unknown in the way we assumed. It was recognized, understood at a level deeper than data, at the level of instinct, and instinct does not lie about survival. It does not negotiate with appearances. It responds to reality as it is, not as it is presented. And if something built entirely around dominance was choosing not to advance, then the reality in front of it was not what we believed it to be. And I felt the shift ripple outward again, this time faster, more defined, as the soldiers adjusted their positions with purpose instead of uncertainty, widening their spacing, increasing their distance from the barrier without being told, because protocol or not, instinct was beginning to take priority, and instinct was telling them the same thing it was telling the creature, that the center of this arena was not safe in the way it was supposed to be, and through all of it, through every recalibration and every quiet adjustment, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been from the start, balanced, steady, and completely unbothered, as if the changes happening around her were expected, as if this was the part of the process she had been waiting for. And that was when the realization settled in fully, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, undeniable conclusion. We had not introduced a variable into a controlled environment. We had introduced the environment into her, and everything we thought we were managing was now reacting to that fact. The moment everyone had been avoiding finally found a place to land, not as an explosion of action, but as a shift in attention so precise it felt like the entire arena turned its focus at once, not toward the creature, not toward the command deck, but toward a single, almost insignificant detail that had been there from the beginning and somehow gone unnoticed, the thin chain resting against her collar. The small metallic tag hanging just below her neckline, moving slightly with each measured breath she took, and I do not know who saw it first, whether it was a technician zooming in out of desperation for clarity, or a soldier whose instincts had narrowed his vision to anything that might explain what he was feeling. But once it was seen, it could not be unseen, and the system picked it up a fraction of a second later, enhancing the image, isolating the object, projecting it above the arena floor with the same neutral precision it used for every other piece of data. Except this time, there was no delay, no hesitation, just a clean, immediate display that cut through the uncertainty like a line drawn across chaos, and the tag rotated slowly in the projection, catching the light in a way that made the engraving impossible to ignore, the letters sharp, deliberate, not decorative, not symbolic, but functional, like a label meant to be read and understood without interpretation. And for a brief moment, no one reacted because reading is a process, and meaning does not always arrive at the same speed as recognition. But then it did, and the effect was instantaneous, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute, because the words did not describe her in the way we expected. They did not classify her as prey, as participant, as variable within a controlled system. They defined something else entirely, something that did not belong in the category we had assigned to her. And I felt the reaction ripple outward in a way that bypassed logic completely, moving straight into instinct, because labels matter not just to systems but to minds. They frame perception. They tell you how to interpret what you're seeing, and when that frame is wrong, everything built on top of it collapses at once. And I heard someone near me inhale sharply, a quiet, involuntary sound that carried more weight than any shouted command could have, because it marked the moment understanding arrived, not fully, not in detail, but enough to change everything. And I looked back down at her, at Emily Carter, and for the first time since the match began, I noticed that she had shifted her gaze, not toward the creature, not toward the crowd, but slightly upward, just enough to acknowledge the projection above her, just enough to confirm that she knew it had been seen, and there was no reaction in her expression, no satisfaction, no tension, just the same steady composure she had maintained from the start, as if the reveal of that information changed nothing for her at all. And that was the most unsettling part, because for everyone else, it changed everything, and the creature responded before any command could be issued, not with aggression, not with retreat, but with stillness, a complete, deliberate halt that removed any ambiguity about its intention, because stillness at that level is not hesitation, it is recognition. It is the moment instinct overrides all other processes and delivers a single, clear directive: do not proceed. And I saw the soldiers react to it immediately, not waiting for orders, not checking protocols, just stepping back in unison as if pulled by the same unseen force, increasing the distance between themselves and the arena floor, their formations widening, their confidence dissolving into something sharper, more cautious, and the crowd followed in their own way, the noise collapsing into silence, so complete it felt like the entire structure had been sealed off from the rest of the world. And in that silence, the meaning of those words settled in fully, not as a concept, not as a label, but as a reality that none of us had prepared for, because we had not been watching a human placed into an arena. We had been watching something else entirely, something that the system had finally named, and now that it had, there was no way to pretend we were still in control of what happened next. The words did not echo, but they did not need to, because once they were seen, they settled into the space with a permanence that no sound could have matched, and I realized that the silence we were experiencing was no longer confusion. It was alignment, the moment when thousands of separate perspectives lock onto the same conclusion at once. Not because they were told to, but because there is no other explanation left that fits. And the system above the arena continued to display the tag with cold precision, the letters unmoving, unchanging, as if repeating them would somehow make them less real. But it did the opposite. Each second that passed without correction only reinforced the meaning, and I saw the command staff finally begin to move with intention. Not the smooth, confident motions of control, but the careful, measured actions of reassessment, new scans initiated, deeper queries sent through restricted channels, attempts to access data that had been locked away, because now there was a reason to look. Now there was a justification for breaking through the layers of limitation that had previously gone unquestioned, and yet the results came back the same: incomplete, fragmented, sections marked beyond clearance, and that repetition became its own answer. Because systems do not hide information without purpose, and whatever purpose existed behind those restrictions, it was no longer theoretical. It was standing in the center of the arena, unchanged by the attention, unaffected by the shift in perception, and that consistency was what made it undeniable. Because if this had been a mistake, if the label had been incorrect, if there had been any error in the classification, there would have been some reaction, some adjustment, some sign that the situation required correction. But there was none. She remained exactly as she had been, balanced, calm, completely at ease in a space that had just redefined itself around her. And I realized that the most important part of the reveal was not the word itself. It was her lack of response to it, because that told us everything we needed to know about its accuracy. It was not new information to her. It was not a revelation. It was a confirmation of something that had always been true. And the creature responded again, this time not with movement, but with orientation, lowering its profile slightly, not in submission as we would define it, but in acknowledgement, in recognition of a hierarchy that existed outside the one we had constructed for this environment. And that shift was mirrored by the soldiers, their positions widening further, their stance no longer directed inward but outward, as if the arena floor had ceased to be the only point of concern. And I understood then that control had not just been lost, it had been reassigned, not through any command, not through any visible action, but through recognition. Because once something is correctly identified, behavior changes automatically, instinct aligns with reality whether you want it to or not, and I felt that alignment settle into the structure itself, into the way the systems continued to operate without interference, into the way no override was issued despite every indication that one should have been, because overriding something requires certainty that you are correcting an error, and there was no longer any certainty left to support that assumption. And for the first time since the match began, I stopped looking for what would happen next, and started understanding that what was happening now was already the outcome, not in the sense of a finished event, but in the sense that the hierarchy had been established, the roles had been redefined, and everything that followed would simply be a consequence of that truth. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter remained still for one final moment, as if allowing that understanding to settle fully across every mind in the arena. Before doing the one thing no one had prepared for, she took a single step forward, not fast, not aggressive, just deliberate. And in that simple motion, every remaining illusion about who controlled that space disappeared completely. That single step should not have meant anything, not by the rules we had relied on for so long, because movement alone does not define dominance. It does not rewrite hierarchies. It does not shift control. And yet every system in that arena reacted to it, as if it did, because the context had already changed, the meaning had already been established. And now the smallest action carried the weight of that understanding. And I felt it in the way the air seemed to tighten, not physically, but perceptually, as if every observer was suddenly aware that they were witnessing the moment where possibility became outcome. And the creature responded first, not with force, not with retreat, but with a controlled adjustment that removed any ambiguity about its intent. It yielded space, just enough to maintain distance without turning away, a precise, measured response that acknowledged her movement without challenging it. And that kind of response is not taught. It is not programmed. It is instinct refined through survival, the recognition of something that does not need to prove itself. And I saw the soldiers react almost immediately, their positions shifting again, not in confusion this time, but in alignment with what they were seeing, widening their perimeter, increasing their distance from the arena floor in a way that mirrored the creature's behavior. Because instinct does not differentiate between species when it comes to survival. It recognizes patterns, and the pattern in front of us was unmistakable. Something had stepped forward, and everything else had stepped back. And that reversal, that simple inversion of expectation, carried more weight than any display of power could have, because it did not rely on force. It relied on recognition. And recognition is immediate. It bypasses doubt. It overrides assumption. It tells you what is real without waiting for confirmation. And I realized that the entire arena had reached that point at the same time. The crowd no longer reacting as spectators, but as witnesses, their silence no longer uncertain, but deliberate. The commentators no longer filling space, but preserving it. Their voices reduced to brief, careful observations that avoided any definitive statements, because there were no definitive statements left to make. Everything that mattered was already visible, already understood. And I looked back at Emily Carter, now one step closer to the creature than she had been before, and I noticed that nothing about her had changed except her position. Her posture remained the same, her breathing steady, her gaze level, and that consistency was what made the moment absolute, because it confirmed that the step had not been a reaction. It had been a choice, a controlled action taken within a framework that she fully understood. And that realization settled into me with a clarity that left no room for doubt. We were not watching an unpredictable event unfold. We were watching a process complete itself, and everything that followed would simply be the visible expression of a decision that had already been made. And the most unsettling part was how quiet that decision had been. No declaration, no escalation, just a single step forward that redefined the entire space. And I understood then that this was what true dominance looked like. Not the display of power, not the assertion of control, but the absence of resistance, the moment when everything else adjusts without being forced, because it has already recognized what stands in front of it. And in that moment, with the arena perfectly still and every observer aligned in that same silent understanding, there was nothing left to question, only the realization that what we had thought was a demonstration had become something else entirely, something we had not prepared for and could no longer influence. Because control had not just shifted, it had been claimed, and it had been claimed without a single word. There was no signal, no command, no dramatic shift to mark what came next. And that was what made it undeniable, because every system in that arena was designed to track escalation, to respond to force, to anticipate conflict. And yet none of those triggers were activated. Nothing crossed a threshold that required intervention. Nothing broke the rules as they were written, and still everything changed because she moved again, not faster, not sharper, just another step forward, measured and precise, closing the distance in a way that felt inevitable rather than aggressive. And the creature adjusted in perfect synchronization, not retreating in panic, not reacting with resistance, but yielding space with a controlled awareness that mirrored her movement exactly, as if the interaction between them had settled into a pattern that required no negotiation, no testing, just recognition and response. And I realized that what we were witnessing was not a confrontation, it was alignment. The kind that happens when two entities understand each other without needing to prove anything, and that understanding carried more weight than any display of strength ever could, because it removed the need for it entirely, and I saw the command staff stop issuing queries, not because they had found answers, but because the answers no longer mattered. Whatever information had been hidden, whatever classifications had been restricted, they had already been validated by what was happening in front of us. And validation at that level does not require data. It requires observation, and observation had become undeniable, and the soldiers along the perimeter shifted. One final time, stepping back beyond the standard boundary markers, creating a space that had not existed before, a buffer that was not defined by protocol, but by instinct, and no one corrected them. No one called them back into formation, because to do so would have meant denying what everyone could now see, that the center of the arena was no longer part of the controlled environment. It had become something else, something self-contained, governed by a different set of rules that we did not write and could not enforce. And through it all, Emily Carter remained exactly as she had been, unchanged in posture, unchanged in expression, her presence steady in a way that made everything around her feel temporary, like the arena itself was just a structure she had stepped into rather than a system she was bound by. And I understood then that the process we had been watching since the beginning had reached its conclusion, not through an outcome we could measure, but through a reality we could no longer deny. The hierarchy had been established, the roles had been defined, and nothing else needed to happen to confirm it, because confirmation had already occurred at every level that mattered. Instinct, behavior, perception, all aligned in the same direction, all pointing to the same truth. And that truth did not require action to prove itself. It simply existed, and everything else adjusted accordingly. And as she took one final step, closing the distance to a point that would have been unthinkable just moments before, the creature did not resist, did not challenge. It held its position with a stillness that carried its own meaning, and in that shared space, with no movement, no sound, and no uncertainty left to resolve, the entire arena understood what had happened, not as a dramatic event, but as a quiet certainty, the kind that does not need to announce itself because it is already accepted. And for the first time since the match began, there was nothing left to anticipate, nothing left to question, only the realization that what we had thought would be decided in that arena had already been decided long before she ever stepped onto its floor. We did not end the match, and that was the part that stayed with me long after the arena lights dimmed and the systems returned to their normal cycles, because there was no signal to terminate, no clear point where anyone could justify stepping in and declaring it complete. The protocols we relied on required measurable outcomes, defined thresholds, and none of those had been crossed. Nothing had broken, nothing had escalated, nothing had forced our hand. And yet everyone in that arena knew it was over, not in the way we were used to, not with a decisive moment or a visible conclusion, but with something far more absolute, the complete removal of doubt. And I remember watching as the command staff slowly disengaged from their stations, not with the usual efficiency of a concluded operation, but with a quiet, almost careful detachment, as if any sudden movement might disrupt something that had already settled into place. And the crowd followed in the same way. No cheers, no disappointment, just a steady, subdued departure that felt more like leaving a place of significance than exiting a form of entertainment, because whatever they had come to see, it had not been what they experienced, and that difference mattered. It lingered, it changed the way they moved, the way they spoke, the way they processed what had just happened. And I realized that the arena itself had changed as well, not physically, not in any way the systems could detect, but in how it would be remembered, because places like that rely on repetition, on predictable outcomes that reinforce a sense of control. And this had broken that pattern completely, not through force, but through absence, through the removal of everything we expected to define the event. And at the center of it all, Emily Carter had not claimed victory, had not acknowledged the outcome in any way that fit our understanding. She simply turned, as if the process had reached its natural conclusion, and walked toward the exit with the same measured pace she had carried from the beginning, and no one stopped her, not the soldiers, not the command staff, not the systems that could have sealed every exit point in less than a second, because stopping her would have required justification. And there was none left to give, not one that aligned with what we had all just witnessed. And I saw the creature remain where it was, still and silent, not pursuing, not reacting, just holding its position with a level of restraint that now felt completely appropriate, because whatever interaction had taken place between them, it had already reached its conclusion, and there was nothing left to resolve. And that was when the final understanding settled in, not as a realization of what she had done, but as a correction of what we had believed from the start. We had not placed a human into an arena. We had placed an arena around something that did not belong to our system of classification, something that operated on a different set of rules, a different scale of understanding, and the word we had seen, the label that had shifted everything in an instant. It had not been a warning, it had not been a threat, it had been a statement of fact, one that required no demonstration to prove its validity. And as I watched her disappear beyond the threshold of the exit, unescorted, unchallenged, I understood that the most dangerous assumption we had made was not that she was weak. It was that we could measure her at all, because what we had witnessed was not strength in the way we defined it. It was something else entirely, something quieter, more absolute, the kind of presence that does not need to assert itself because it is already recognized. And that is when the thought finally formed in a way that left no room for doubt. We were never observing the strongest thing in that arena. We were observing the reason strength exists in the first place, and we had mistaken it for something that needed to prove itself.